Okay. So this is my book. I think I'm going to keep the whole apartheid part of the talk relatively brief because I want to cover a lot of the American side. So I think you will get a lot of the apartheid part from my book, which really is about the youth movement against apartheid. I was 17 when the Soweto uprising took place, and that's when the police in South Africa opened fire on students middle grade and high school students who were protesting for a better education system. And it was a big turning point in the struggle. And at that age, I was very influenced by it and became an activist and was an activist for large parts of my life in South Africa. And so I felt that that was something that really needed to be captured. And so that's what my book really covers. What I'm going to do is give you a framework. Nelson Mandela, one of the genius things about Nelson Mandela was that he helped South Africans see apartheid as a system, that he kind of could look at it from a very high level view, and he showed South Africans that this was a system that brutalized both the people who were oppressed and the oppressor themselves, and no one was left untouched by this very brutal system. So I'm going to try and show you from a high level view the system of apartheid, but then also give you some of the parallels with the system of slavery, Jim Crow, but also then draw it through into today. The main focus will be on, we're going to follow the money, basically. We're going to look at the laws and follow the money, and I'm going to try and thread it all through for you. So if we start with apartheid, what was the definition of apartheid? If you look online, Wikipedia, and various encyclopedias, you'll see a definition of white supremacy or segregation, where whites dominated other race groups. I think this is a Wikipedia definition, but excuse me. What those definitions don't do is they don't cover the why. They don't cover the motive behind apartheid. And so I have a different definition, and it's my own definition. Literally, the word apartheid means apartness, but it really was a system of laws that was designed to exploit Black people's labor for the creation and retention of wealth for white people. And I think this was, to me, a much more apt description because it covers the why apartheid happened, why it lasted so long, and why people were, generally the white government in South Africa was so desperate to hang on to it. Excuse me. So South Africa was colonized in the 1600s, and from that time all the way through for the next few centuries, South Africa was like any other colony, mainly used for its agricultural wealth. The natives were put to work on farms, and there were a lot of crops that were not native to those areas, so such as cotton, sugarcane, especially in South Africa, tobacco. And in the Cape, we had the very first colonizers brought wine. They brought grape seedlings, and the wine industry started from that very first time. However, everything changed for South Africa in the 1860s and 1880s with the discovery of diamonds and gold. And it became very apparent to the colonizers that South Africa had virtually or literally the largest deposits of diamonds and gold in the world. And this bore out because for the next 100 years, South Africa was the world's biggest producer of diamonds and gold. And I didn't know this until about 3 years ago, when I was researching my book, or 4 years ago. But but that made it totally changed my perception of why apartheid lasted for so long, and the sheer amount of wealth that was hidden in the mines of this country. And eventually, there was one company in particular that came to dominate both the gold and diamond fields, and this was Anglo-American. And the Anglo part of Anglo-American was a German entrepreneur called Oppenheimer, and he had become a British citizen. So he made up the Anglo part. The American part was a bank very well known to most people in America called JP Morgan. And JP Morgan will surface again in America later on. But on the left is the Eureka diamond. It was the size of about an egg, and it was the first large diamond discovered in South Africa. And the Star of Africa on the right, 84 carats, was about the size of the palm of my hand. And so this was just, you know, these were just some very, very few numbers of diamonds that were found in South Africa. So the important problem was how to mine all this wealth. Can you all see this photograph? You can see it? Okay. Because I can see your picture, but I can't see the full photograph. But these are my grandparents. They remind me of that painting, the American Gothic. I think my grandfather's just missing the pitchfork. But basically, 9 generations of my own family grew up colonized, basically. My grandfather was born and brought up in India, but India had been colonized for centuries before he left. And then he moved to South Africa thinking, oh, it was just another British colony, not realizing that he was going fairly soon after about 40 years after he came in. No, 20 years after he came into South Africa, apartheid began. But already under the British, this was under the British rule. The British had brought these Indian indentured laborers from India to come and work on the sugarcane fields, because the problem was they couldn't get African people to work on the fields or in the mines, because they were quite happy with a small piece of land, a couple of goats, some cows, and they didn't have this need to accumulate any wealth. And so they had the British colonizers had brought a lot of indentured Indian laborers to work on the sugarcane fields, especially. But then once diamonds and golds were discovered, they realized that these indentured laborers were now reaching the end of their term of their contracts, and they were looking to buy land and settle down in South Africa. And so they passed laws that banned Indians from owning a mine or land anywhere near a mine. All political rights of Africans were taken away to, again, try and secure all these mines. But Indians had no political rights at all. And there were lots of other laws that were passed, but these were just 2 that I've picked out. But one of the most important laws that was passed was the Land Reform Act. And basically what that did was it took away 93% of the land. And 93% of the land was basically owned by white people, and only 7% by Black people. So overnight, Blacks woke up not having land to bury their dead. Another important law was about job reservation. So all skilled jobs and managerial jobs on mines or anywhere were basically reserved for whites. Africans were forced into unskilled labor, and they were basically not educated. And the whole idea was to get them to a point of starvation, so they were forced to work on the mine. So this was all under British rule. So apartheid was basically already present. However, in 1948, through gerrymandering and a redrawing of the electoral districts, favoring mainly rural areas, the Afrikaners. Now, the Afrikaners were Dutch descendants. So there were 2 sets of white people that colonized South Africa mainly. So there were the Dutch descendants who came via the Dutch East India Company, and then the British who came through the British East India Company. And they had a very nasty war, the Anglo-Boer War, and there were two wars. And in that time, the British actually murdered in concentration camps 28,000 Afrikaners. So the Afrikaners had, you know, had this rage of wanting to take the country back, and through a very select type of gerrymandering process, they managed to win the election. So the popular vote was actually won by the British, but the Afrikaners won the electoral districts. And then they began this thing called apartheid. So the first two laws that they passed were, one, the basically a what they call the Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act. And so people of color and whites could not marry, and they could not basically have sex with each other. A police force the police were actually were tasked with following people whom they thought were couples, and they had to catch them in the act. So they would be hanging around trying to take pictures, and this went on for decades. The law also said that the landlord on whose premises the act took place could be charged, spend up to 7 years in prison. And the second law, which even Nazi Germany did, was basically every citizen had to be classified either as white or non-white, and under non-whites they were further classified as African, Indian, or colored. And then there was a whole swath of laws that fell into these groups here. So why I'm putting this in a triangle is I'm showing how easy it is actually to pass significant, you don't actually need a lot of laws to ensure that the majority population is basically forced into poverty. So you segregate housing. So they passed a law called the Group Areas Act, and people had to live in their various, in the 4 group areas. Passed miscegenation laws, and then job reservation, redlining, and you basically deny education. So by doing that, by reserving jobs, you prevent people from earning enough money or earning any major significant money to buy housing, etc. By redlining, you prevent them from living in areas that may allow them to advance and get better education. And then by denying them this education, you make sure that you have this constant flow of labor, unskilled labor. And at the same time, you disenfranchise and prevent people from voting. And in that way, you can, South African whites made up only 20% of the population, but they dominated the other 80% of the population. And a lot of times people only talk about apartheid and how terrible it was, but there was a huge struggle against apartheid that began, from the very beginning. It began from the first time the first colonizers came. And a lot of this is covered in my book. So this was the Women's March, 20,000 women marched on Parliament. This was Nelson Mandela. I think this was during the Defiance campaign in the 1950s. And Steve Biko, and these 2 photographs are from the Soweto uprising that I talk about in my book. So it seems like I'm jumping, but this took, decades and decades of struggle. But in 1990, Nelson Mandela was released, and and the government had reached a point of negotiation. And as I think there was a significant role played by Americans in this. In 1985, there were 2 groups of people within America who actually fought really hard to end apartheid. And the one was the Black Caucus in government, in Congress. They and African American groups all over the country actually tried. They protested in front of the South African embassy. About 4,500 people got arrested. And it was an ongoing thing that went on for years. And the other set of were the students, the college students who had huge protests. They created fake shanty towns on campuses, and they even went to the United Nations and to speak against the apartheid government. And these forces then forced the American government to actually to consider sanctions. In 1985, the Black Caucus in government passed or tried to pass a law, but Ronald Reagan vetoed that. But in 1986, they tried again. And once America passed sanctions, the rest of Europe began passing sanctions, and the apartheid state became close to bankrupt. Apartheid became impossible to sustain economically. But at the same time, there was a lot of internal protesting, and that was going on. So Mandela was released, and after 4 years of negotiations, many times which were touch and go, we had elections in 1994. So some of the lessons that, in retrospect, and these are my lessons that I'm kind of putting forward, was that one of the most important organizations that happened was the United Democratic Front. And this was a huge umbrella body of about 800 organizations that ranged from white organizations that were objecting to the draft that was only for white young, especially only men, but white young men, to all the way to youth movements on the Black side. There were labor movements. There were, huge numbers of organizations that formed this giant body. And only then, and they would call a stay away, for example. And if they called for a stay away just one day, the entire country shut down. It was like a public holiday, and that made a huge difference, because again, it pressured the government at a financial level. Nelson Mandela's government made up close to 50% of women, took his lead, and they began to treat its citizens as people, not the enemy. And Mandela himself created a sense of community. As I was saying, he showed us what apartheid was as a system, and basically said that if you can make such a system, you can dismantle such a system. One of the most important things he and Bishop Desmond Tutu did was they pushed for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was basically a process by which policemen, secret covert organizations, etc., were offered amnesty in exchange of the truth. And so it only really touched the tip of the iceberg, because it only looked at atrocities committed by the police or the secret organizations that the government had set up. But on the plus side, it was televised. And every night, the entire country literally was glued to their TV, because we all wanted to know what had happened. And there were thousands of people whose family members had disappeared, and they needed to know the truth. So I think it was harrowing, but at the same time, in a strange way, quite healing, because the purpose was to restore justice. It was mainly restorative rather than retributive justice, and so it wasn't aimed at punishing people. But if the commissioners felt that, and they had investigators to look into various cases, but if the commissioners felt that you were holding back on the truth and you were lying, there would be a court case and you would be charged and not given amnesty. So there was some sort of accountability. It was it wasn't as broad as it should have been, but I think what it also did was it isolated these white supremacist groups and made them much more fringe, because it brought the rest of the people together. The laws were dismantled, secret law enforcement organizations were defunded, but they absconded with billions of dollars too. Policemen in various townships were replaced with community workers. And the community workers were the first line to go to when there was a domestic dispute or some sort of minor, and police were not the first line of call. The community workers eventually became a huge, they also became AIDS activists. They also became a way of getting to the community during elections. And so they served multiple purposes. And one of the biggest and most difficult areas was trying to reach economic balance. And so the government started a broad-based Black economic empowerment program. But I think it's still very much a work in progress. It hasn't yet, by any means. The income disparity in South Africa is huge, and this hasn't actually dented it that much. So, okay, that's apartheid. So I applied the same definition to America and to slavery in America, and really it applies, right? So slavery was a system of laws designed to exploit Black people's bodies and labor for the creation and retention of wealth for white people. And I just wanted to put this lithograph up because I felt that, you know, it's very easy to talk about slavery as with numbers and, you know, to just talk about it as a system, but it was a very tragic and very real system. And I feel like this mother-daughter duo just kind of captures what it was. You know, that could be me. I look at that and I'm thinking, what if that was my daughter being sold off? And so I think it's just sometimes important to remember that it was enormously tragic for people who had been enslaved or people who were enslaved. This man on the left here he was called Peter, and it's a photograph that was used by abolitionists very widely. The keloid scars indicate to me, from a medical perspective, each keloid scar indicates that he had multiple cuts that had gone deep, very deep into his dermis, and that's how he developed such keloid scars. But in total, there were 340,000 people who were brought to America as slaves. And on the eve of the Civil War, sorry, I'm going to move this down. On the eve of the Civil War, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the 15 slave states. And there were 500,000 free Black people. So about 90% of Black people in this country were enslaved. And I think it's probably a fair estimate to say that 90% of African Americans today, approximately 90% of African Americans today in this country are the descendants of slaves. There were huge numbers of laws that affected enslaved people, but again, some of them were key. One was that if you tried to escape, you would be punished. And there were 5 levels of punishment. On your first attempt, you would be whipped. On your second attempt, you would be branded on the cheek or on your chest with your owner's initials. With your third attempt, you would have an ear cut off. With your fourth attempt, castrated. And with the 5th attempt, you would be killed. Anyone who tried to educate slaves, to teach them how to read or write or helped them in any way would themselves be punished. So the slave codes ensured that the system actually was maintained. And again, as with apartheid, you know, there was many times when slaves did fight for their own freedom. There were at least 2 attempts made on ships that were still bringing people over here, and 2 successful attempts where people actually managed to escape and gain their freedom. But in the end, guns, germs, and genocide basically won the day. Okay, so again, we're following the money, and if we follow the money to the south, 1 in 3 white families in the Confederate States owned slaves. And if the Confederacy was a separate nation, it would have ranked the 4th richest in the world at the start of the Civil War. So again, as with South Africa, we are talking about huge amounts of money. The price for an enslaved person was, in today's days, today's money, it was $80,000 to $140,000 per enslaved person. So if you had a family of enslaved people, you were basically a millionaire in 1860. And there was a premium paid for artisans and cooks and discounts for known runaways. But the North wasn't entirely innocent in all of that. Connecticut had the most number of enslaved people in the Northeast, about 6,500. 1 in 4 Connecticut estates actually had slaves. And there were huge numbers of jobs that were created in the North from slavery. So there were barrel makers, sail makers, rope makers, shackle makers. I'm sure there's another word for them, but I call them shackle makers. Agents, insurers, lawyers, clerks, all of these were involved in the sales of slaves. And newspapers made money from advertising, either for escaped slaves or for the sale of people. Millions of gallons of rum was manufactured in New England, and it went to Africa to buy more Black people. And the majority of cotton produced by the labor of enslaved people in the US South was brought to the North, to the textile mills in the Northeast. So this slide I've just put up, the Civil War began in 1861 and it ended in 1865 in May. And Lincoln died just a couple of weeks before then. 3 weeks before then. But there were slaves who were still continued to be enslaved well until, for example, in Texas, they were not told that they were free until the Union soldiers actually rode into Texas. And so many African Americans today only regard the end of slavery as having happened on Juneteenth, what they call Juneteenth, which is 19th of June, 1865, when the majority of people were actually freed. And in places like Delaware and Kentucky, slaves were not freed until after the 13th Amendment was ratified. And on Christmas Eve, in December 1865, the Ku Klux Klan had already been formed. But there was a very short period, about a 10-year period, when, things were actually working. In 1865, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery was passed, but there was one exception, that you could still enslave a person as a punishment for a crime. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act. The 14th Amendment granted US citizenship to former slaves, and the 15th forbid racial discrimination in voting, but again, that only applied to men. And in a matter of 10 years, 2,000 Black men ran for office, and about more than a dozen were elected to the US Congress. And they passed very important laws, which actually we still benefit from today, and in particular, free public education systems, which we still have today. And over a 3-year period, 15% of office holders in the South were Black. So African Americans made huge progress in a very short period of time, because they'd just been waiting and planning for this, because it was something they really were desperate for. But very soon after, Southern whites made a deal with the Northern whites, basically, and they pulled out federal troops from the South. And so what happened then was that these Southern states and many of the Northern states had passed laws which were called the Black Code laws. And one of the key laws in this was this exception, which was in the 13th Amendment, except as a punishment for crime. And so many of these slave states then used a vagrancy law to arrest Black people. This book, Slavery by Another Name, starts off, the opening chapter describes a young man from Alabama who had been arrested on a vagrancy law for basically nothing. He was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months in prison. But then he was expected to pay the court fees and the clerk fees and every other fee that for his case. And because he had no money, he was enslaved, basically imprisoned for a full year and more. And he was then re-enslaved and sold to US Steel and sent to mines owned by JP Morgan. So everything's kind of connected in a way. What JP Morgan was doing in South African mines, they were doing in US mines to Black people, either in South Africa or in the US. But this was also then the beginning of felon disenfranchisement, because these people who were arrested and then eventually were released sometimes were no longer allowed to vote. And in addition to that, it also began an entire system of policing of Black people again, which we still see today. So this led to an era that lasted almost 100 years called the Jim Crow era. And again, the Jim Crow era was a system of laws designed to exploit Black people's labor for the creation and retention of wealth for white people. As with South Africa, it was very easy with just a handful of laws to ensure that Black people remained in poverty and segregated. So you had the segregation laws. For example, in California, Chinese people had to live in Chinese areas. In California, Chinese people were not allowed to vote. In almost every southern state that used to be a slave state, Black people, there were huge restrictions placed on Black people being voting. And then you had job reservation and redlining. I'll talk a little bit more about redlining, but basically redlining was aimed at not allowing Black people to move into certain areas which were reserved for whites. And in that way, you know, you could deny people a good education or an even equal education and keep them in poverty. So this was what happened even in the North. There was job reservation. Some of it was actually in the laws, but some of it was just in practice. A lot of it was in practice. People would only hire whites for management positions, for example, as it was in South Africa under apartheid. But the government played a role as well. The government defined these areas which they actually allocated to Black people, and they would not allow housing loans for Black people outside of these red areas. Banks and insurance agents then colluded with government to not provide mortgages and insurance for these same Black homeowners. So even if they earned enough, they couldn't actually buy in some of these other areas. So this is Hartford on the left, the bottom left. And this year on the top right is Oakland. And these red areas are where Black people were allowed homes, but they were not allowed to live in these other areas. And today we see a very similar thing happening in terms of these areas have now also become food deserts and digital deserts. So you have very few supermarkets and fresh food delivery places in these areas. And you also have very poor digital covering. So companies like Comcast don't see the need to run cables through a lot of these areas. And so a lot of, and this perpetuates this entire generational poverty that we see continuously happening in America. On the other hand, the government gave subsidized housing loans for white people. So there was this huge disparity which continued to worsen. And because of this job reservation and redlining, you had lower income because we have a system of public education funded by local taxes, the poorer areas invariably have lower taxes and less money. And so you had segregated and underfunded schools because of this. There was an interesting thing. In South Africa, we had, apartheid was divided into what we call grand apartheid and petty apartheid. And grand apartheid was where everything, the funding for everything was divided by race. So whites, for example, whites' education, healthcare, everything, we saw this in healthcare where whites had the best equipment, the best hospitals. And then the other three race groups had a kind of declining, with the Indians getting the next best, Africans getting, coloreds, the mixed race group getting slightly less than that, and Africans getting the absolute least. But that was grand apartheid. And then we had petty apartheid, where you see a lot of photographs of people not being allowed to go onto beaches or sit on park benches. And I always dismissed petty apartheid as just a kind of, petty. But my cousin, who was actually a part of the student uprising and was arrested and kept in solitary confinement for 4 months at the age of 17, he's now a history professor in Cape Town. And he's writing a whole book about how petty apartheid was a kind of psychological warfare. And just talking to him, I only spoke to him about this a few weeks ago, and it seems it kind of just, struck me as this is absolutely true. So under Jim Crow, you had this kind of like an effigy, and this says, this N-word voted. And this was a way of basically psychologically terrifying people to prevent them from coming out to vote. This, I think, had to be made by a psychopath, because it shows a number of Black babies, and at the bottom it says alligator bait. And I think this kind of continuous, the continuous kind of attacks are like death by 1,000 cuts. And in addition to this kind of everyday racism, there were also attacks, white terrorism attacks on Black people. And I've listed just a few here. These three in purple were actually instigated by false claims of rape of white women. And this in 1921 was Tulsa, and Tulsa was an interesting place because a lot of Black people and Native Americans had been allocated very arid land in these areas, but in Tulsa and in this area called Greenwood. So everyone thought this land is not worth much, but then they discovered oil on this land. And so a lot of these Black people became very wealthy, and there was a lot of antagonism and jealousy on them. And so so there was a young girl who was in an elevator with a young Black man, and she was the elevator operator, and she actually said nothing happened, but a man outside claimed that she had been attacked by the young man. But it seemed like a very planned attack, because in 24 hours, there were actual bombs thrown from planes over this area. People attacked the Greenwood area. They killed up to 100 to 300 Black people. No one knows how many exactly. And at the end of it, they flattened an area double the size of Ground Zero in 9/11. I think 30 blocks were absolutely flattened from the air, and all this in 24 hours. But I talk about Tulsa because really, it was, and then And then they stole whatever they could. They looted everything they could. About 6,000 Black people were arrested, and no white people were arrested at all. But the reason I talk about Tulsa is because I feel like if that had not happened, these were the people who had, they call it the Black Wall Street for a good reason, because they would have been the people who would have inspired generations after generation of people to actually, you know, do well and actually supported other Black people. So then an extended civil rights struggle happened, and I found this interesting when I plotted out the dates, that there were 4 very progressive young men who were murdered in a spate of 5 years. There were no conservatives murdered in this time. And I can't help thinking, I know it sounds like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I can't help thinking that there was something more behind this. But they were all, both, I think MLK Jr. and Robert Kennedy were basically, they were all in their early 40s or 39. I think Malcolm X was 39 as well. So very young men. But the Civil Rights Act was one of the key legislation that basically changed America. And as with the end of slavery, it banned segregation in both public and private places. The government could sue school districts that persisted with racism. It barred federal funding from states that discriminated. And it had a huge impact on women's rights and LGBTQ rights as well. Even today, the Supreme Court in the last 5 to 10 years have quoted the Civil Rights Act when they passed legislation, or when they passed judgment on some cases related to LGBTQ cases.
Manju?
Yes.
I apologize for interrupting you. So often in these wonderful programs, not just the library, but you know, there's no time for questions.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yes. Yes.
Really wanted to have time for questions.
Okay, I shall go very quickly.
Wanted to...
I'm actually coming to the end now. So thank you, Eileen, for reminding me. Let me just move this up now again. Okay. So do we still have this today? See, I'm in today now. We do. Do we have a system of laws? Yes. That exploits Black people's labor? Yes. Unfortunately, for the creation and retention of wealth for white people? Unfortunately, yes. We still have this, except as a punishment for crime in our 13th Amendment. And what we have here is Bill Clinton's crime bill in 1994, which caused a huge upswing in the prison and jail population, jail being people waiting for their case to be heard. It eliminated higher education for inmates, supplied lots of money for community policing, increased the number of police officers. There was mandatory sentencing, so judges had no ability to give a lower sentence. It built new prisons for kids. And the 3 strikes provision, which is even for a minor marijuana offense, just possession of marijuana, if you were caught 3 times, you were sentenced for life. But when you look at this giant prison industrial complex, you see that there's lots of money to be made again. We have the world's largest population of prisoners, 2.3 million. 500,000 of them are just awaiting trial. They don't have enough money for bail. 220,000 are drug addiction, 550,000 are mental health issues, and 250,000 are women. You know, their children are growing up without their mothers, and we have 54,000 children in prison, higher than any other country in the world. And again, we have this skewed. For example, even in Connecticut, we have, you know, a huge dichotomy between the population and the people in prison. And this is a really great movie to watch. It's called 13th by Ava DuVernay, and it's on Netflix. But again, lots of money to be made by prisons, prison labor. telemarketing and call centers, Victoria's Secrets, your Microsoft shrink wrapping comes up, food packaging and agriculture. And what scares me the most is private equity is now getting involved in prisons. And this is not even taking into account prisons for immigrants, you know, illegal immigrants. So this is a big money making. And this is a $183 billion industry, which is our taxpayer money, basically. The end result is this huge wealth gap between whites. This was 2016 data, which is net household wealth for whites, which is 140,000 versus just 10 to 15,000 for Blacks and Hispanics. So where are we now? You know, there's a lot of people who complain so bitterly about how we are very divided. But if you look at slavery and the Civil War, it's estimated that 250,000 Americans died on both sides. So 250,000, 40,000 of them were Black on the Union side, 250,000 on the Confederate side. And I think America, especially white America, has been divided from that time onwards. America's always been divided by race, but even white America has been divided. We've had the Civil War, we have had fight for civil rights, and now we have the Black Lives Matter protests. And so the question I ask myself is, would white people vote for a Black man? And unfortunately, the answer is no. In the 2008 elections, 55% of white people voted for McCain. In the 2012, it was 59%. And for comparison, I've put up 2016, 58%. So since the 1970s, since the Civil Rights Act, since they've been actually collecting this data, the majority of white people have not voted for anything other than Republican. On the plus side, Obama did get in, and that's because of the combined vote of this committed group of whites as well as the people of color. So I'm just going to skip through these quickly. And basically, this is my to-do list of what we should do. We have to acknowledge what happened. As with South Africa, we had to, I feel that there is an apology that needs to be made by white people to Black people. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. We need to stop police brutality. It's, we spend less money today on PPEs than on militarizing our police. We need to end modern day slavery. We need to reinstate affirmative action. Affirmative action with job reservation, etc., has worked very well for white people. It needs to be applied again to Black people. And I will move on. We have a Zulu saying, Umuntu Gabuntu Gumuntu Gabuntu, which is a person because of other people. And this is a Pan-African kind of saying, and it's the reason Africans have survived under such difficult conditions all these times, is that they have a strong sense of community, that they are only people because of other people. And so we need to reconsider the way we approach race in this country. And I believe that our actions or our inactions will echo far beyond ourselves and well into our future and the future of this planet. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Well, I guess I better ask my question here.
Yes.
So I heard a talk by the woman who wrote The Black Sash.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to ask about that. It was a group of white middle-class women in South Africa.
Yeah.
That you know, stood from the 50s on, stood for the end of apartheid. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, they were absolutely committed. They were, there was a very strong core of white South Africans. Many of them were Jewish. They had left Nazi Germany, tried to seek refuge in South Africa, but the Aliens Act, actually the Afrikaner government passed what is called the Aliens Act to prevent Jews from coming from Nazi Germany into South Africa. but they couldn't entirely pass the act. So there were still loopholes, and a lot of Jews came from Germany to South Africa. A lot of Jews came from Lithuania, and they were educated. They became lawyers. They fought. I mean, most of Nelson Mandela's legal team was Jewish lawyers. There were the Black Sash was, you know, they would protest. They were committed. There were groups of white people who would go to prison every day to find out how many children had been arrested, because there was a couple, and I write about this in my book, is there was a couple whose son had been arrested at the age of 17, and they didn't know which prison he was, because the law allowed the government to actually keep you for 3 months without telling your parents or anyone that you were in prison, and without legal representation.
Wow.
So they started the Detainee Parents Committee, and they would go to every prison in the country to try and make a list of which kids were in prison. So
wow.
It was very much, all this is very hidden. Nobody really talks about it because everyone just thinks it was Mandela. It was all black and white. It was not. It was a huge mixture of people. But the majority of people, of course, were black people. And I have to say, in all honesty, the people who suffered the most were black people. You know, they bore the brunt of the brutality. They were tortured, murdered. I mean, you know.
No question, no question.
So, yes.
I also wanted to share this. It's a newspaper clipping of a woman dancing the toi toi.
Oh, yeah.
It was a dance in the bus on the way to Nelson Mandela's inauguration.
Right.
It was called Dance a Toi Toi. She's singing on a train from Soweto to Nelson Mandela's inauguration in Pretoria. And I remember reading about it.
Yeah.
In 1994, and that, you know, people lined up for days in order to vote.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, the line, I was in London. That's one of my big disappointments, is I wasn't in South Africa, but for the first time, my entire family had not voted for 9 generations. So the first person to vote in our family was my father, and he was 60. He was 64 when he went.
How glorious is that?
And so, yeah, people, I mean, the entire generations had never voted. And even today, I think we still have, South Africa as a turnout. That first election, I think it was about 95% voter turnout compared to America, which is like 50%. So we really
Thank you. Other people may have questions. I'm so appreciative of your work.
Thank you.
In comparison between the two countries.
Yeah, I feel like it needs more,
more connection. I just say I was in Cape Town for the Parliament of the World's Religions in December 1999.
Right.
I remember the tension in the air, but also the excitement.
Yeah.
Just in equal measures.
Yeah, and you know, South Africa, just as soon as it got independence, there was so much that happened. The AIDS epidemic happened. The digital divide has just caused chaos. You know, just as you're trying to address the differences in the schools, you know, now the white schools have computers, they're computer literate. We can produce a guy like Elon Musk, and yet we have poverty and unemployment of 36% and 50%.
Yeah, it breaks my heart. Thank you.
Yeah.
Manju, I have a question/comment. I mean, obviously there are a lot of parallels, but the United States is not South Africa. It's not majority black. I mean, how do you, you know, simple answer is education, but how do you convey an understanding of what's transpired? You know, South Africa, in one sense, it's easy. I mean, it was like, you know, it was really in your face. Now you could say that's, well, also true to the United States, but again, I think a lot of white people don't have a huge amount of empathy for some populations of black people because they don't even see them.
Yeah.
And they don't know the history as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to an educator in our local school, and she said, I said, you know, they were applying for a grant, and I'm like, why don't you just meet up with the kids in New London or the educators in New London and just kind of get to know them and have, you know, propose a joint grant? And she's like, my students are afraid of New London. And I'm like, why? Oh, they're afraid of Black students. Like, seriously? Like, you know, the irony is that if any population should be afraid of any other population, it's Black people should be afraid of white people. I mean, the amount of devastation that whites have caused on Blacks, the number of women that have been raped by white men, you know, I mean, seriously, I just find it amazing that our local school kids are afraid to talk to kids in New London. Mm-hmm. And until we get over that, we're just never going to fix this problem. Jean, you had a question.
As a person who lives in a very rural community where there's very few Blacks, and as an older person who can't easily travel now, despite COVID, what organization or effort do you most recommend for someone in this situation to try to be useful?
Well, you know, I personally think that when I put this talk together, I realized that this entire country has benefited when Black people, I'm not talking about Asians and, you know, Black people get into federal government. I mean, we have public education because of them from the beginning. We have Civil Rights Act for women and, oh, sorry. And then we have healthcare because of a Black president. So personally, I think that if you have money, I would suggest supporting Black law, people running for office, either at the local level or at the federal level. In terms of donations, again, the NAACP, they're doing really good work in terms of trying to pay for bail for protesters. Because, you know, a lot of protesters are unemployed. They can't even afford to get out of jail now. And so I think that, and to be honest, I give a lot of money to the food bank. I honestly, I think people are going to starve, and this pandemic is going to wreak havoc on us. So.
Yeah, I agree with all of those and do participate. But I want to thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Jean.
Very nice. Very good.
Thank you.
And your book focuses on young white South Africans or young Black South Africans?
Blacks. So in South Africa, the term
Did you say Black? Did you say Black?
Yes, Black.
Okay.
In South Africa, because we were all regarded as non-white, you know, Africans, Indians, and coloreds, which were the mixed race group, we renamed ourselves as Black. So when we talk about Black in South Africa, or we used to under apartheid talk about Black, we would talk about Black as all three of the people of color.
Got it.
So my story is really about, and you know, I think whites played a role, but really the biggest role was played by people of color. And it's been very underplayed because a lot of movies have been made about white people and what they did, but there's a lot of Black people who did a lot. And those movies don't get funded, except for the movies about Mandela.
Okay. Oh, I have to say.
What's that?
No, it's just a special thing. I'm a minister and I was ordained on the day that Nelson Mandela walked out of prison.
Oh.
This is very cool.
That's
February 11. I'll never forget it. February 11, 1990.
1990.
I didn't even know it at the time, but it's a lovely thing.
And it's a great way to remember, because I mean, God, we never thought they would release him. Honestly, I was glued to the TV for 5 hours because they took so long to release him. And my husband was in Cape Town, and I was sitting in front of the TV with my son, and I'm just like, he was a baby, he was a toddler, and I'm just like, this is not going to happen. We're going to go backwards again. So, you know, I sit here today in America, and I watch these elections with a fear that, is like from previous, like I feel I'm suffering from PTSD nowadays.
I could
Because
get that.
so much is riding on this. I think that this is a real turning point for America.
I don't think you're alone.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
I just wanted to say I thought this was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
And you know, I just wanted to, I would love to give this talk to students in high school. I just, if you had any, I tried to, this is how I started talking to our local educator, and she was like, as soon as she said, my kids are afraid of Black people, I'm just like, oh, I don't know if I can do anything for you now.
Maybe Jean, that could be something that you go to work on. Somehow,
Yep.
Caroline Birchfield.
Yeah, that occurred to me.
Yes, cool.
Yeah.
And Housatonic too.
I was gonna say, we do have, for better or worse, quite a few private schools here who are resource.
Well, I've been giving this, well, I've been
Very
talking about my
doable.
book, not this.
Very doable.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The private schools are actually very open to this kind of talk, and I've given a few locally. And you know, if you just want to put me in touch, I'm happy to talk to them. But it's nice when, you know, it's nice when it comes as a recommendation.
Where are you, Manju?
In Mystic.
Mystic.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank
You are welcome. Thank you for coming.
Oh, pleasure. I wouldn't have
Thank
missed
you.
it.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence, for all you do.
You're all welcome. I'm sorry there weren't more people here, but it was really.
We'll just have to be big mouths and talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, I don't know, I gave this talk not realizing that it might, you know, there might be some interest, and so maybe I should write it up as a book. So we'll see.
Very good. Very good. That would be a different book. True.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Bye-bye.
Good night, my friends.
Good night.